of us go about our lives with very little awareness of serious crime and criminality. Most of us are essentially law-abiding, minus a few harmless vices. But real crime, theft, violence, murder, etc., fortunately, these are not everyday occurrences for most of us. Yet the underworld, the darker side of humanity, is never far away. Crime happens everywhere, and at all levels, but we just mercifully live our lives in blissful ignorance of it most of the time. Once in a while, though, it bubbles to the surface of our awareness, and we can't simply ignore it any longer. It's always a jarring experience, and it motivates us to get involved and to do something about it. Unfortunately, it's just human nature not to get worked up enough to take action until a problem has become both tragically bad and glaringly obvious. And this is one of the main ways that the energies of the elusive dwarf planet Pluto manifests in our lives, exerting a corrupting influence and then revealing that corruption once it's infested and rotted some area of our life through and through. Pluto has spent the last 15 years in Capricorn, from the 2008 financial crisis to our current one, which also happens to be a supply chain crisis, an environmental crisis, a political crisis, and so on. Pluto, to the Romans, was also Hades to the Greeks, and in both cases the myth goes that he kidnapped the goddess of fertility and seasonality and made her his queen. This ultimately caused the annual diminishing of the life force of the earth, the changing of the seasons, leading to the association of Pluto with death, rebirth, and transformation. But Pluto has an even darker side. Pluto, or Hades, rules the underworld, land of the dead, source of great power and wealth, and also where things are hidden, secrets are kept, and humanity is manipulated through our darker impulses. Therefore, the underworld is, of course, associated with crime, but particularly the organized kind, the devious, manipulative, and dominating hidden hand that pulls our strings in ways that we can't see. When Pluto was in Capricorn, this manifested as physical tyranny and the theft of physical wealth, with the major superpowers of the Western world fighting proxy wars and overthrowing regimes to acquire rights to rare earth minerals, steadily increasing their military bases, manipulating riots, locking down populations, forcing extreme climate agendas, and debasing physical currencies in unthinkable levels of debt. As Pluto moves into Aquarius, we begin the digital transformation of tyranny and the manipulation and weaponization of science, technology, politics, and activism. If we look closely, we can already see what will become more and more undeniable over time, that these pillars of our modern society have rotted from the inside. They've become so corrupt that they're essentially useless to us in their current form. On a grand scale, this is a natural process. It's part of the evolution of our understanding of science, technology, politics, and so on, and their limits and vulnerabilities. But natural as this process may be, it still sucks pretty hard to go through, to experience, especially over a 20-plus year transit. But Pluto's always somewhere, so we're always going through this process in some aspect of our lives. This time, the people of the collective West are going to feel this transit in a big way, and many of us are going to transform our lives as a result. In this episode, we'll complete our exploration of the dark side of Pluto's transit through Aquarius by examining the transformation that will take place as a result, how the polarizing nature of Pluto is twisting and shaping our society, how our very genetics are being hacked and programmed by transhumanist extremists, how our political views and forms of activism are being weaponized against us, and how this period represents a kind of collective shadow work where we face ancestral trauma and the karma of how the West has corrupted science, technology, and politics to maintain their hegemony for the last few hundred years. Stay tuned for episode 10, part 3 and conclusion of my series on this important transit, Hades and Aquarius, which starts right now. Welcome to the Postmugglism podcast. My name is Nate, aka Postmugglism, and this is my show. Thanks for tuning in to my 10th episode titled Hades and Aquarius, Part 3. If you're listening or watching for the first time, please click the subscribe button so that you'll get notified each week as I release new episodes of this show. This podcast is about magic, of course, but specifically it's about the kind of magic that we can use to thrive in the decline of Western civilization through the transformative but turbulent times ahead, and the ways that magic and related topics like astrology, for example, can help us understand what's happening in the world and to put it in perspective in a useful way. That's what this series, Hades and Aquarius, has been all about, understanding the forces that shape the world for good or ill so that we can develop strategies to flourish despite the drama that we're living through. This episode is the final of 3 episodes on the transit of Pluto through Aquarius, in which I've discussed the significations of Pluto and of Aquarius and the various threads coming out of Pluto's time in Capricorn that we can follow to understand how this story will unfold in the next 2 decades that Pluto spends in Aquarius. Previously, we talked about how the United States Pluto return in the February of 2022, on the eve of the war in Ukraine, indicates that the United States will set the tone and pace for the emergence of a new digital version of totalitarianism as the enabler of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, fueled by war and manufactured crisis. We talked about how science has been claimed by the state and how tech companies have been infiltrated by the U.S. national security apparatus. We talked about how the combination of propaganda, censorship, and psychological manipulation at scale is used to manufacture consent for globalist agendas. Then we discussed how the wealth of the world is being stolen through hyperinflation, climate hysteria, and so-called international aid. How Ukraine's democratically elected government was overthrown by the US, and a puppet government was installed that was willing to provoke conflict with Russia, sacrifice its people and resources, and launder money for corrupt heads of state and their adjacent criminal enterprises in the resulting chaos. We looked forward in the timeline to see how the digital world morphs as corruption rots the tech industry from the inside, leading to a world run on mandatory apps and controlled by fake AI, governed by the national security apparatus, where every aspect of your life is surveilled, tracked, analyzed, taxed, and controlled, using your livelihood and security as leverage to keep you compliant. Worst of all, we examine the rising threat of biotyranny and bio-authoritarianism, where your ability to choose what happens to your body is no longer a sacred right, and transhumanist elites experiment on the human population in their deranged pursuit of demiurgic perfection. In this final episode of the series, we'll discuss the polarizing effects of Pluto and how that's reshaping and dividing society and culture. We'll talk about archetypal death and rebirth and how that could manifest for the collective West during this transit, and about how our best intentions are being used against us to turn us against each other, steal our wealth, and make us submit willingly to elitist billionaires that want to use us as lab rats and slaves. And finally, we'll discuss how all this corruption is the trauma and karma of the imperialist West's long years of abusing science, technology, and politics to dominate and subjugate the rest of the world. A trip into the underworld, into Pluto's domain, is always a transformative experience, but transformation isn't necessarily a positive process. Things can change for the worse, and in some cases, this change for the worse is fated and must happen in order to make space for necessary healing to take place later. Pluto excels at this kind of it must get worse before it gets better stuff. It doesn't simply shine a light on the evils of the world, exactly the opposite, in fact. It fosters corruption until the rot is unsustainable and evil collapses under its own weight. Pluto is accelerationist, propelling us forward on the timeline by fueling our most combustible inclinations. Pluto rules extremes and extremism, and this manifests in humanity as vices, kinks, and obsession with power. Our shadow selves are the secret hidden things that motivate us in ways that we often can't see or won't face, and Pluto rules this part of each of us. And this is a big deal because trauma subconsciously drives more of our lives than we'd care to admit. The underworld not only contains the dead, but also our fears, which are usually projections of the worst parts of ourselves onto the world around us. These are also our greatest vulnerabilities, and since Pluto represents the criminal underworld, our fears can be manipulated by nefarious forces to compel us into compliance with objectively terrible things, as we've discussed for most of the last 2 episodes. But one of the most insidious ways our fears are used against us is to divide us amongst ourselves, according to political opinions which have largely been manufactured on both sides of every issue. Nowhere is this more obvious than the United States, though Britain and arguably France, Australia, and other places are significantly divided between right and left ideologies as well. It has reached such a peak in the US that for the first time since the Civil War, elected officials are openly discussing a national divorce. In fact, a poll from 2023 shows that as many as 66 million Americans feel this way. Whether this is a good idea or not, or even feasible, is beside the point. It's just patently obvious that Americans are at each other's throats in a way that is clearly unsustainable, despite sharing mostly the same priorities and values when compared with the rest of the world. Pluto causes the mob to move to the extreme on every issue, and the plutonic forces at work in the intelligence community have weaponized this tendency to support the ambitions of the global elite. This divide has been deepening dramatically as Pluto has been on the approach to Aquarius over the last few years, according to a series of reports from the Pew Research Center. In 2014, around 40% of Americans saw the opposing party as a threat to the well-being of the country. In 2022, this number had climbed to 80%. I very much doubt that 80% of Americans are aware of any of the, I suggest, vital concerns that I've identified in this series, yet most are very deeply concerned about the political views of their neighbors. Together we stand, divided we fall, and the national security apparatus does everything in its power to fan the flames of every disagreement they can into a culture war to foment, disrupt, and distract. Think of the rising violent crime at protests since the 2020 BLM riots. It's become increasingly commonplace for feds to show up at every public gathering, sometimes dropping off piles of bricks and other supplies to encourage violence to erupt. 25 people lost their lives during the political unrest of the summer of 2020 while the BLM riots were taking place, and mostly to other citizens rather than due to interactions with the police, ironically. In addition to the violence against people, more damage was done to the property in the wake of George Floyd's death than any other riot or protest in American history, totaling between $1 and $2 billion in damages. Protesters were stoked into becoming rioters during the BLM protests, and in various protests since, causing chaos and billions in damages to ensue. The damage was extensive, the violence was real, but the media compared the resulting lawlessness to the civil rights movement. The protests devolved into riots, which devolved further into various manifestations of violent anarchy in locations throughout the country. In Seattle, this took the form of the Chaz, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, a neighborhood that the Democratic mayor ceded to protesters for about 3 weeks, in which time the landowners and businesses which had legal rights to be there, as in they paid their taxes and so forth, were at the mercy of BLM, Antifa, an assorted collection of criminals and violent extremists LARPing anarchy. After several deaths, including one disabled person, the Chaz was finally disbanded by the Seattle police after more than 3 weeks. I review this aging history to point out the extreme tolerance that the establishment demonstrated for very specific aspects of the 2020 riots. The actual protests of George Floyd's death were met with brutal resistance initially, but the media coverage created an opportunity for political grandstanding that the Democrats simply couldn't resist. The circus was strung out for weeks, causing tremendous damage and allowing clashes between hyped-up rioters to occur, which resulted in the lawlessness and regrettable deaths of the Chaz in Seattle and the later incidents in Kenosha, Washington, where Kyle Rittenhouse killed and seriously injured several people, among other similar tragedies. In comparison, the so-called insurrection that took place on January 6, 2021, which has been hyped up to a frothy level of outrage on the left, is reported to have caused only $1.5 million in damages. Video evidence was recently released to Tucker Carlson by Speaker McCarthy from the Capitol on January 6. The video is linked in the show description below if you'd like to watch yourself, which shows people being allowed into the Capitol, given free rein to mill around, take photos and souvenirs, and so on. Yet outside, the scenes from a small area on one side of the Capitol building turned into actual chaos as a minority of protesters began inciting violence and creating a dangerous situation. A character named Ray Epps can be seen on video at this time, instigating the crowd to enter the Capitol building, which would have been a federal crime, but Epps, unlike the other January 6 insurrectionists, has never been arrested. This video is linked in the description below as well. And perhaps the most recognizable character from the January 6 incident is the Q shaman, a man named Jacob Shanley, who appears to be maybe a little mentally ill. He was led through the Capitol building by a pair of police officers who even opened various doors for him and generally made sure that he was on all the security cameras for a really long time. Jacob was sentenced to 4 years in prison for his involvement in the deadly insurrection, as the liberal media refers to it. What's more insane than this pathetically obvious false flag operation is that it actually worked to convince roughly half the U.S. population, and liberals around the world, that the right wing of the electorate and their party's elected officials within the government were domestic terrorists. And since then, the rhetoric has only increased its aggressive tone as the New York Attorney General weighs arresting former President Trump in an unprecedented display of partisan hackery. The best part of which is that Trump could probably be legitimately arrested for fraud for any number of his shady businesses, but the particular charge at hand sort of redefines the term trumped up. At both protests, the public was encouraged to break the rules, to take it too far, so that the state could be justified in coming down hard, and in both cases, the way the situation was handled depended entirely on the narrative that the establishment wanted to create. They'll support a movement when it makes them look good, and then turn on them as soon as no one's looking. The Democrats didn't support the BLM movement authentically. They took advantage of it and then cast it aside. The January 6 rioters were encouraged to enter the Capitol, just as Antifa was emboldened to occupy a neighborhood in Seattle because it benefited the state, not because it somehow held the state accountable. All of this is just a distraction, which is to say, manipulation. There is no right and left wing of politics. There's just the uniparty, a false dichotomy designed to entrap us into thinking that we're involved and can make a difference, so that we stay heavily invested into social issues and safely away from economic policy, foreign relations, and the anti-war movement. Keeping us divided and increasing our anxiety makes us more reliant on the state and technology, which has been thoroughly infiltrated by the state's intelligence apparatus. This keeps us distracted with constant paranoia about each other so that we don't wake up and overwhelm the state. All of this is Plutonic energy at work. The tyrannical state using our fears to whip us into paranoid frenzy against each other, to weaken us into compliance, has big Pluto energy. To understand the implications of this energy moving into Aquarius, we need only look at how social media algorithms prioritize drama. Arguably, nothing has ever been so polarizing as social media, which insidiously uses dopamine triggers to get us addicted to chasing social media clout. The result of which is that people are trained to fill their timeline with hot takes designed to elicit reactions rather than inspire thought or communicate something of value. The vapid state of mind required to chase clout makes you the perfect, malleable tool for manufacturing consent as you parrot whatever social virtue is deemed most appropriate at the current moment. Where does this go from here? We can expect further polarization between the camps of people who identify as left or right-wing, as well as a growing anti-culture of people abandoning this system. And there are certainly indications that this crack in the Union could fracture the U.S. into shards of regions of red or blue aligned states. Regardless, with Pluto in Aquarius, during this time I think the focus, for now anyway, will be on widening the ideological divide and keeping us physically separate through digital means, health passports, smart cities, and so on. What can we do about these things? Well, it's absolutely essential that we do not engage in divisive, combative political discourse. It serves absolutely no purpose for us, damages us energetically and spiritually, and serves the ultimate goal of our would-be overlords, to make it easier for them to control us. We can start every engagement with another human being from a place of kindness and tolerance and attempt to establish common ground with them to reduce the potential that we arrive at an impasse later. We can actively listen, even to people whom we disagree with, and try to understand where they're coming from. And we can know in our bones that we are stronger together than we are alone. Pluto's effects are often summed up as simply transformative, but to put that in context, the signification comes from the myth of the kidnapping of Persephone, goddess of the seasons and fertility, by Hades, or Pluto to the Romans. In the underworld, Hades persists at asking Persephone to eat food that he brings her, and eventually she consumes 6 pomegranate seeds, which, by the laws of the underworld, meant that she would have to remain there forever. After Persephone is rescued, Hades uses this deceit to compel Zeus to strike the bargain that Persephone would spend a month in the underworld each year for each pomegranate seed she consumed, 6 months a year. When Persephone was separated from her mother Demeter, goddess of agriculture, her mother's grieving drained the life force of the world, creating the annual seasons. This is why Pluto rules transformation, because of his corruption of Persephone, which is to say, the corruption of virgin potential. I'll venture a guess that most of us have experienced our own Demeter moment, where the earth drops out from under you and something that you've protected and nourished is taken from you, abused, corrupted, and is never quite the same again. This is the reality of the rebirth cycle. It's a progression from wide-eyed naivety to jaded experience to transcendent awareness and acceptance. We mature through all the little deaths where our various expectations and the parts of our ego meet their end, are decomposed, and used as fuel for our future growth. Like death, a visit to the underworld is a karmic process in which balance must be achieved, like the bargain struck by Zeus and Hades, 6 months for 6 pomegranate seeds. This myth demonstrates the pattern by which Pluto manifests in the world, revealing the darkness through the corruption of our unsustainable naivety. The offer of pomegranate seeds, sweet and refreshing to the parched Persephone, was a honey trap that led to her corruption. The honey trap that the global elite, that is, heads of state and criminal enterprise, the billionaire class, financial market movers, and so on, are using on us is social virtue, providing us the sense of belonging digitally that we're starved of physically, and feeding our tendency towards self-righteousness as well. The establishment hypes us up about climate change, viral pandemics, the culture war, Russian aggression, and so on, to make us run to the safety of that sense of belonging they've cultivated in us through in-culture virtue signaling. And in that state, we're primed for social media platforms with their Pavlovian dopamine triggers to train us to parrot any narrative the establishment feeds us without question. While we've been distracted with the constant parade of social justice issues, our various heads of state have been making the most out of every legitimate crisis of the last 15 years. From the financial crisis of 2008 and the war on terrorism, to the environmental crisis and the pandemic, they've taken every opportunity to give themselves remarkable new powers to surveil, tax, and control us. As this great deception moves into the digital age, the pieces are already falling into place to restrict our mobility, our supply chains, and our physical assets, and the focus shifts to controlling and manipulating the flow of information itself, so that reality can be subverted by the establishment to gradually manufacture consent for their outrageous long-term agenda. When we're in crisis and divided, we're more easily controlled. We're more inclined to paranoia and fear-based thinking, and more likely to depend on the establishment, who needs our compliance to force a dramatic restructuring upon our society. While I believe that we will eventually move towards a decentralized society where we're more dependent on the people around us than any centralized government, at first, the corruption of our society through the co-opting of technology and science will force us to live through a period of great loneliness. We're already becoming increasingly isolated, unless we work very hard not to be, and this isolation makes us perpetually dependent on human-machine interfaces, screens, instead of each other. This is why the globalists want a metaverse, digital passports, mandatory apps, and federalized cryptocurrencies. Digital interfaces allow the establishment to insert itself invisibly into every transaction, every interaction, every thought you have, and everything you do. Sadly, Pluto in Aquarius reinforces this societal shift into a hybrid physical-digital species. A great portion of many people's future lives will be lived online, perhaps similar to how the book or movie Ready Player One envisioned the future. The physical world is becoming less and less of a priority, and the highly controlled and manipulated digital reality will offer pleasant escapism by design. Most of us weren't aware of all the physical tyranny of Pluto and Capricorn when it was happening, and this transit won't be any different. Humanity won't recognize Pluto's hidden hand moving in the shadows of Aquarius until the damage is already done. And what damage is that? Well, our isolation and the deprivation of our humanity, the gradual reduction of all self-aware thought to produce easily controlled drones and meat suits that they can use for their transhumanist experiments. This is what we get when we follow the people that say they own the science and that we will own nothing and be happy. If you listen to any of the World Economic Forum's many such marketing messages, they describe a convenient, fairly utopian communist future, which, whatever. But then if you listen to the panels and presentations which take place at their super elite annual convention in Davos, they constantly refer to themselves as elites. So their idea of utopia is just fascist totalitarianism with clever marketing. It would be easy to dismiss the left and the Davos elite as a bunch of blowhards, but much of the audience also crosses over with the G20 and COP26 crowds, and it's inclusive of heads of state, big tech CEOs, reclusive billionaires, and pharma executives, among others, but is allowed only very tightly controlled media coverage. This is a breeding ground for plutocracy, and the WEF's Young Global Leaders program is a literal training ground for the minions of plutocrats and a pipeline into positions of power within the establishment. And crazy as this sounds, this is no conspiracy theory. It's something that Klaus Schwab, head of the WEF, regularly brags about. The rebirth of society that these totalitarian cuckoos want to see is indeed a divided one, just not along political lines, but along lines of wealth and power, which is why they've all gone off the rails in their attempts to rob us and force us to submit to their bio-authoritarian and climate agendas. They're running out of time to oppress us totally before the world realizes that their checks have started bouncing and 20th century Western hegemony collapses completely. Essential to this future is the vision of transhumanism, leaving Earth to conquer the galaxy rather than having to face the music for the problems we've created here on this planet. To achieve these goals, these megalomaniacs believe they need control not only of our actions, but of our literal bodies and minds. Let's listen to a particularly unnerving example of this agenda in plain speak from one of the WEF's favorite transhumanist advocates, Yuval Noah Harari.
So I want to talk to you today about the future of our species, and really the future of life. We are probably one of the last generations of Homo sapiens. Within a century or two, Earth will be dominated by entities that are more different from us than we are different from Neanderthals or from chimpanzees. Because in the coming generations, we will learn how to engineer bodies and brains and minds. These will be the main products of the economy, of the 21st century economy. Not textiles and vehicles and weapons, but bodies and brains and minds. Now, how exactly will the future masters of the planet look like? This will be decided by the people who own the data. Those who control the data control the future not just of humanity, but the future of life itself. Because today, data is the most important asset in the world. In ancient times, land was the most important asset. And if too much land became concentrated in too few hands, humanity split into aristocrats and commoners. Then in the modern age, in the last 2 centuries, machinery replaced land as the most important asset. And if too many of the machines became concentrated in too few hands, humanity split into classes, into capitalists and proletariats. Now data is replacing machinery as the most important asset. And if too much of the data becomes concentrated in too few hands, humanity will split not into classes, it will split into species, into different species. Now, why is data so important? It's important because we've reached the point when we can hack not just computers, we can hack human beings and other organisms. There is a lot of talk these days about hacking computers and email accounts and bank accounts and mobile phones, but actually we are gaining the ability to hack human beings. Now, what do you need in order to hack a human being? You need 2 things. You need a lot of computing power, and you need a lot of data, especially biometric data. Not data about what I buy or where I go, but data about what is happening inside my body and inside my brain. Until today, nobody had the necessary computing power and the necessary data to hack humanity. Even if the Soviet KGB or the Spanish Inquisition followed you around everywhere, 24 hours a day, watching everything you do, listening to everything you say, still they didn't have the computing power and the biological knowledge necessary to make sense of what was happening inside your body and brain and to understand how you feel and what you think and what you want. But this is now changing because of 2 simultaneous revolutions. On the one hand, advances in computer science, and especially the rise of machine learning and AI, are giving us the necessary computing power. And at the same time, advances in biology, and especially in brain science, are giving us the necessary understanding, biological understanding. You can really summarize 150 years of biological research since Charles Darwin in 3 words. Organisms are algorithms. This is the big insight of the modern life sciences, that organisms, whether viruses or bananas or humans, they are really just biochemical algorithms. And we are learning how to decipher these algorithms. Now, when the 2 revolutions merge, when the infotech revolution merges with the biotech revolution, what you get is the ability to hack human beings.
Obviously, Yuval doesn't come right out and say that he believes humanity splitting not into classes but different species is a good thing, so long as you are part of the dominant species. But you can see that he believes it. And let's not miss the most important detail in this clip, when he says that this technocratic tyranny was never possible before because they lack the processing power and biometric data. This has been my point throughout this entire series. Pluto in Capricorn was about gaining control over the physical world, physical wealth, and our physical bodies. Pluto in Aquarius is going to be about controlling our genetic code, our thoughts and minds, our biodata, etc. And the byproduct of all of this will be that our physical bodies are locked down and experimented on. For what purpose? To attempt to shift the human race from an animal that evolved naturally to an animal-machine hybrid whose evolution is controlled by more evolved elite technocrats. The transhumanist future is a dark one. Pluto's time in Aquarius doesn't take us this far, though. That's a bit down the road. In the next 20 years, however, we will decide if we're going to voluntarily hand over all of our data, including our biodata, and empower these maniacs to hack and rewrite humanity according to their dark purposes. Isolating us, getting our bodies accustomed to being regulated by pharmaceutical products, teaching us to eat bug protein, to stay glued to screens and indoors. Kind of sounds like we're being conditioned for life in space, doesn't it? Sadly, for most of us, this would be a cramped life of sunless, soulless labor to support the decadent lifestyles of these technocratic elites. The good news is that we don't have to go along with this absurd and terrible vision of the future if we stop being compliant, and it may have to be good enough that some of us avoid this future. A portion of humanity may very well go along with this narrative all the way to the extreme, but we can make choices now that spare us from the worst of this tragedy. In particular, we can invest into a natural future. We can move out of the urban environments that are destined to become mega smart cities, where it will be all too easy to experiment on the population, as their essential resources like food and water can be easily used as mass delivery systems. Urban environments also make it easier to enforce compliance and create leverage. A radical form of non-participation is necessary to flourish in the digital tyranny to come. The digital world can be tightly surveilled and controlled, but we can opt out of centralized systems and build alternative networks to support free and independent ways of life. This is not a simple transition. It's a significant transformation which will eventually reconfigure society into many smaller, regional, self-governing communities. It is a very Aquarian energy, though I expect this transit will only lay seeds which will remain dormant still for some time while the world adjusts to the various implications. In the meantime, we have some darkness to endure, some trauma to process, and some technological tyranny to live through. As Western dominance crumbles, the people in power will become desperate and try to retain that power through digital totalitarianism. We can only help to cautiously and studiously avoid their grip over the next few decades. Urban environments are a liability because it's pretty simple to control us when we have nowhere to go. Every street corner is surveilled 24/7 and movement can be easily restricted. You can move away from the city, increase your resilience, meaning building an independent supply chain, planning for energy storage, becoming more independent, and so on. You can take back your autonomy and make up your own mind and make the radical choice to opt out of this tragic anti-life society. Corruption is a funny thing. It hides under the surface, typical in appearance to everything around it, but secretly rotten to the core. Hiding in plain sight, corruption tries its very best to look good, harmless even, beneficial if possible, because that helps it remain hidden and able to spread its insidious corruption. This is why corruption often hides within things which are otherwise intended for good. Philanthropy, and as I mentioned in the last episode, aid, are great examples of this. These things seem very reasonable, even altruistic, and that enables them to slip past our cognitive defenses. Gavi, the global vaccine initiative sponsored by the WHO and the Gates Foundation, is the perfect example of this phenomenon. A number of legal charges have been pursued against them for bribing and extorting political officials in impoverished African countries to distribute their experimental vaccines to those populations without their knowledge. And in a shocking display of hypocrisy, Gavi actually markets itself as a proponent of fairness and equality in the distribution of vaccines, which, given the evidence, is clearly and intentionally disingenuous. Another example is Black Lives Matter, which seems on the surface like a movement which ostensibly any sane person would support if their message was actually as their name would seem to suggest. But BLM really isn't about Black lives mattering to people or to the establishment because there isn't anything in their vision statement about increasing Black representation in government, addressing systemic violence, or holding the state accountable for their crimes. From BLM's website, their vision statement is as follows. Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation imagines a world where Black people across the diaspora thrive, experience joy, and are not defined by their struggles. By achieving liberation, we envision a future that is fully divested from police, prisons, and all punishment paradigms to be replaced with investment into justice, joy, and culture. But I couldn't find any indication on their website of what their strategy for achieving liberation actually is, and every time BLM appears in the news, it's either for setting fire to a city or misappropriation of donations. This riot-inducing activist organization has no clear strategy, no measurable mission, and numerous scandals adding up to millions and millions in stolen donations. This is just what real philanthropy looks like. It also looks like the Gates Foundation writing off billions in pharma research as charitable donations. Corruption doesn't appear corrupt. It tries very hard to appear innocent and altruistic. It wants to be able to conduct its dirty business while unquestionable and untouchable. And because it presents as guileless, we give it latitude that we wouldn't give anything else. Everyone wants to support a good cause, especially if they can be seen doing so. Corruption plays on this very human weakness to turn our greed and selfishness into complicity. Group consciousness, which is to say society, is one of the most important significations of Aquarius for the purpose of understanding this transit. If Pluto represents corruption and hidden power dynamics, and Aquarius represents the shared consciousness of the mob, then it's easy to see that the weaponization of the mob through psychological manipulation is going to be one of the recurring themes over the next 20-odd years. Corruption accusations aside, it's probably most fair to simply judge modern activism by its accomplishments. Let's take the BLM protests of 2020, which were focused around the idea of defunding the police. This seems like a reasonable, actionable, and measurable outcome. So let's see what kind of impact Black Lives Matter and the 2020 protests actually had towards accomplishing this goal. Well, contrary to the performative show put on during the violent protests of 2020 and the many promises from Democrats to enact meaningful change, ABC News reported in the fall of 2022 that 83% of a sample of 100 cities and counties from across the nation actually increased spending by at least 2%. So, despite all that violence and property damage, the deaths, the weeks of local residents being terrorized, and the endless airtime that it received, exactly nothing was accomplished. Instead of defunding the police, the BLM riots facilitated the further militarization of the police across the country and desensitized the population to seeing cities on fire and the police abusing protesters. It greatly exacerbated the growing polarization of the left and right wings of American politics, which set the tone for the same division in all Western nations. Far from exercising any power over the establishment when we protest, the establishment controls and directly benefits by weaponizing our best intentions into the rule of the mob. Activism used to serve the needs of the citizenry, but thanks to our increasingly digital world and its increasingly comprehensive surveillance, old-fashioned take-to-the-streets activism simply doesn't work anymore. Worse, it serves the establishment by gathering all the dissenters into one place where they can be easily kettled, tagged, and tracked, and be penalized without their knowledge far into the future. And the collective mob that participates in performative activism like the BLM riots is simply another division of the enforcement arm of totalitarianism. During the 2020 riots, it became commonplace for Antifa and BLM-affiliated protesters to harass people at restaurants and otherwise going about their normal lives, rather than directing their angst at the establishment. Likewise, many small businesses were destroyed, looted, etc., and this was during the pandemic when the establishment was effectively shutting down businesses left and right already. But it was still somehow permissible for all of these thousands of people to break social distancing protocols and other rules and laws. It's very obvious, to me at least, that the activist organizations which currently support the narratives desired by the establishment are given great latitude, while those which attempt dissent are snuffed out financially, brought under trumped-up legal charges, and tagged, tracked, and harassed in various ways. Clearly, the concept of activism, like so many others, has been co-opted and corrupted by the establishment to the point that it's of no further value to us. So, what do we do instead? Well, first of all, we have to stop trying to solve the problem by appealing to our oppressors. We've been trained that activism is simply a public show of solidarity when there are many different expressions, and that one just so happens to be the easiest for the state to quash when it doesn't suit their interests. More important and more effective than taking to the streets is the quiet dissent of non-participation, the sabotage of boycotts, and the undermining of centralized authority through the decentralization of media and information sharing. Our greatest weakness now is that reality is being filtered so much that we barely have any idea what's going on most of the time. Building communication and information sharing networks that are offline or at least decentralized will serve us well in the technocracy ahead. Establishing alternative currencies and secondary markets that operate beyond the reaches of digital surveillance is another excellent way to take power from the establishment. Operating in cash and spending it directly in your local community to avoid tax exposure is an important form of non-participation as well because it actually robs the state of revenue and power. And we should find ways to establish common ground with one another, to resolve our differences as a community and band together against the state, their globalist plutocrats, and the minions that enforce their oppression on us, and avoid pitting ourselves against each other above all. In shamanic traditions, the underworld is far from a frightening place, though it's certainly confusing. Shamans visit the underworld to retrieve lost soul parts, those pieces of us that fracture in traumatic situations and regress into our subconscious, preventing us from maturing naturally in some related area of life. Traumas like this end up becoming negative patterns which continue to manifest in our life until we process and release the trauma energetically. Karma shows up in our lives and even our bodies in the same way because karmic lessons are usually the result of traumas that we either suffered or caused in prior lives. Causing trauma is energetically traumatic to the offender as well as the victim in any situation because we are not actually separate and we're always only hurting ourselves in the cosmic sense when we're harming others. When we encounter a challenge in our personal lives, particularly from some external source like a person who might be abusing or oppressing us in some way, then we can rest assured that by this shamanic logic, there is some aspect of our karma that needs to be worked out, and this other person is simply a reflection of our own projections, that is to say, beliefs about the world. Like most powerful medicine, this can be a difficult pill to swallow, but this has certainly been my experience as a shamanic energy healer, and I'm definitely not the first person to say this. It was very much part of my training that this was taught and demonstrated to me through my own experiences working on my shadow, the parts of myself I don't like and tend to hide from myself. This shadow work is really an essential part of living a spiritually, emotionally, and physically healthy life, and it enriches your relationships and your interactions with other people immensely. You realize after a while that you're never struggling against anyone else in your life, in the day-to-day kinds of struggles. But really, you're just working out your own bullshit on other people all the time. Shamanic lineages refer to this type of deep psychological and spiritual work as visiting the underworld, and even in the Greek myths, the underworld was a place the heroes visited to gain special knowledge and power. Journeying into the underworld is a way to learn secrets and to discover treasures. The underworld in this metaphor is the collective unconscious, or the imaginal, and in an animist framework of thinking, that is shared by all spirit, human, plant, animal, fairy, angelic, and so on. We can only really exist in this state between incarnations, so thus the underworld is to us the land of the dead. However, as Gordon White points out in Starships, we are like Horus, who can follow the path of Osiris into the underworld to learn its secrets. But as Horus, unlike Osiris, we can return to the land of the living with this wisdom. And this is true as a collective, as much as it is as an individual. We each carry the karma of our lineage, our ancestry, and as a collective, this adds up to a lot of karma. Pluto's odd and elliptical orbit brings it from the hidden realm to the forefront slowly, and its energetic effects work the same way. It can be difficult to see Pluto's corrupting influence at first, but over time, Pluto gradually brings the dark into the light. This process of fostering darkness and allowing it to slowly reveal itself so that it's eventually purged is a karmic process. Transformation is a karmic process. Pluto rules the transformative work of shamanic soul retrievals and underworld journeys, and with Pluto's long generational transits, its effects are inherently more about the collective than the individual. In that sense, it's not unreasonable to suggest that the karmic debt that we're due to face with Pluto in Aquarius, as the collective West, and particularly the United States, is manifesting as technocratic elitism and global class warfare because it is the karmic manifestation of our imperialist history, using science and technology to dominate and oppress cultures around the world. It's fair to assume that we're due for a reckoning on these issues. And let's not forget that Pluto rules our deep hidden fears and insecurities, the ones that we've developed identities and belief systems around. Many of these are assumptions about reality, the universe, etc., based on little to no empirical evidence. Societal programming, religious beliefs, social mores, and so on are embedded within the layers of belief and identity that comprise your preferences and opinions, and they are rife with programming and neurosis. Of course, the corrupting influence of Pluto takes advantage of these weaknesses as a way to expose them and teach karmic lessons. And thus, we are motivated to become our worst selves through our greatest weaknesses to learn our biggest karmic lessons. And that's a sobering thought worth sitting with as we face down the coming technocracy, the restructuring of society, and the greatest transfer of wealth in the history of the world. Did we ask for these things? Did we bring this on ourselves? I think the answer is unavoidably and quite embarrassingly, yes. Yes, I do think that we asked for this. I think that we continue to bring this on ourselves, and that the way out of it is to face the karmic debt, to learn the important lessons, and to do this collectively. This will take some time, obviously, but we don't really have an alternative but to live through it and try to heal the trauma we're obviously processing along the way. We can do this by helping others realize what's happening to them and how to begin their own healing journeys, by separating themselves from the self-destructive, anti-life system that we all grew up in, that is so deeply fucking broken and incoherent, and by moving towards coherence with each other, with the natural world, and with spirit. It's a long process, likely much longer than Pluto's time in Aquarius. But I think there is an opportunity for Pluto and Pisces to transform spirituality in the ways that I'm describing. So perhaps we can cling to that hope as we endure and learn from the next 20-ish years of Pluto in Aquarius. All right, we're nearing the end of this long and admittedly intense series on Pluto in Aquarius. There are, of course, plenty of other important significations and predictions for this potent transit, but there are also plenty of much more qualified astrologers who are making videos about all of that stuff. What I felt was missing from our popular understanding of this transit and the next 2 decades that it represents is the influence of a global, elitist, criminal element which has become synonymous with government and inseparable from science and technology. Many of us became aware of this hidden hand at work in the world during Pluto's time in Capricorn because it affected us financially and physically. With Pluto's move into Aquarius, this corruption and tyranny shifts into the airy digital realms, tracking us, absorbing our metadata, and using it to manipulate us into willing compliance. Those of us who dissent can be easily silenced, and since we increasingly view the world through screens, it's likewise easy to craft a convenient narrative to manufacture consent, so it's becoming more and more difficult to discern the truth every day. The global intelligence community has infiltrated tech and science and does the bidding of globalist plutocrats who believe that they can live forever as techno-fascist superhuman cyborgs, and they talk openly about their plans to domesticate us as a lower species. We've been programmed, socially pressured, and demonized into compliance with increasingly more obscene intrusions into our private lives, biodata, thoughts, and opinions. Our mobility has been restricted in the very recent past, our economies destroyed, our wealth laundered, our international reputation squandered, and our bodies experimented on by people who made billions from our suffering and who gaslit us about it the entire goddamn time. They fed us lies about green energy, climate responsibility, energy availability, and the need to protect democracy, to loosen our purse strings, and bleed us dry financially, all while flooding the market with cheap currency and causing prices to skyrocket with hyperinflation, supply chain crisis, and war profiteering. Billions and billions in taxpayer dollars have been pumped into Ukraine, which has already been discovered fleeing the country in the luggage of Ukrainian politicians. And the Biden family's long-standing ties in Ukraine are so questionable as to warrant being brought before Congress as part of an ongoing investigation into the now president's actions as vice president under Obama. State, tech, pharma, the military-industrial complex, and criminal enterprise are all merging into one amorphous and plutonic entity. The governments of the world are eyeing digital IDs, health passports, and mandatory all-in-one government apps to facilitate total surveillance and, eventually, to provide the biometric data our globalist tech overlords crave so much. And all of it will be tied into a social credit system and your finances through government-issue programmable cryptocurrency, so dissent will be punished financially and by denying access to social services. The combination of climate change and the viral pandemics, which they supposedly cause now, is the establishment's 1-2 punch to restrict our mobility. Surveillance, crypto, and the social credit system is how they'll control us digitally. Once we're trapped in this system, they'll force feed us experimental pharmaceuticals while they tinker with their gene editing platform. Perhaps they'll even forego our participation entirely and just leak more viruses from their secret gain-of-function labs. The future holds a high potential for the gravest sort of human rights violations because our technology has far surpassed our humanity. Pluto encourages extremism, and so does the Western intelligence community when it supports the narrative that they're trying to sell. Feds and obvious Fed assets show up at nearly every significant protest to encourage violence and are likely instigating long before the actual event. Activism is turned into anarchy and then weaponized to terrorize the locals, force businesses to close, and sow more division and distrust in the population. Because keeping us at each other's throats means we're not able to hold the establishment responsible in any meaningful way. Philanthropy, social activism, politics, these have all been corrupted like science and technology. And for the next 20 years, during this transit, we can assume that they've been weaponized and will be used against us. Where's all of this heading? Well, the globalist dream is to turn us into a genetically engineered subspecies that they can use as slaves and lab rats while they go off and conquer the galaxy. And since we obviously wouldn't go along with this if it were presented to us honestly, the plan is to move us gradually towards this goal as they refine their genetic modification platform through mandatory vaccine programs, lab leaks, and other things like that. I won't lie to you. The corruption and attempts at control become very intense during this transit, probably mostly on the front end over the next 4 to 5 years. Total surveillance becomes a fact of life, particularly in urban environments. Censorship and propaganda reach their peak in the same period. For the next few years at least, the truth will be very difficult to discern, and everything that we hear will be an attempt to mislead and manipulate us. It will take effort to stay free and independent, and probably some sacrifice. But we're going through this transit for a reason, a good one, and facing this experience head-on will allow us to conquer and overcome it. Pluto corrupts, but he also reveals the rot so that we can purge it if we're ready and willing. We have to be willing to change, to live differently, to prioritize different things, to abandon convenience and naivety in form of doing what's right, what's in balance, and what's sustainable. If we want to thrive in this time, separation and non-participation are our best strategies. The old forms of activism have been co-opted and corrupted, and they serve different masters now. Instead of appealing to the establishment, we can win by ignoring them, by banding together in small communities, and by operating beyond their reach. We have to put aside our social and political differences and try to find common ground with each other so that we can forge new understanding and compromise. Our isolation empowers our would-be overlords and weakens us tremendously. Their attempts to manipulate us fail when we're networked together in real, person-to-person relationships because we're smarter together and more capable and stronger. Our money and our access to social services and the supply chain are some of our most sensitive vulnerabilities. The establishment will use these pressure points to enforce compliance, so we need to do everything that we can to isolate and protect our wealth and to maintain our own supply chain network. The best way to avoid the coming tyranny is to opt out of the system in whatever ways you can, starting small and expanding over time. Make the changes necessary to support a healthy life, physically, of course, but also mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And recognize that there are lessons that have to be learned through this process, both as a collective as well as individually. Our collective lessons are karmic in nature. The imperialism that built the West did so by leveraging technology, science, and political intrigue. So it's karmically fitting then that the decline and fall of the West should be the result of corruption in tech, science, and politics. Going through this experience is about the collective learning how to responsibly wield these powers of science, technology, and so on. There's no avoiding a generational transit, and there's no reason to fear it either. Pluto can be scary, unpleasant stuff that we generally want to avoid, but we know what's up for grabs in Aquarius. Science, technology, and the structure of society, and so on. So it's up to us to lean into this transit, to manifest the transformation that we want to see, that we desperately need. Or we can allow transhumanist psychopaths to chart a dark, depressing, and mechanical course for humanity's future. A technocratic future is inevitable, but your personal mileage can vary. You can avoid the worst of the darkness by keeping to the light, by building real human connections and connecting with nature, by taking responsibility for your resilience, your personal supply chain, and your physical, emotional, and spiritual health. We can focus on recovering our humanity, while the rest of the world loses theirs. Thanks so much for tuning in to episode 10, and this final episode of my 3-part series, Hades in Aquarius. This has been an intense subject and a wild ride. Some of this subject is heavy, and much of it may be hard to believe at first, but I appreciate you listening with an open mind. This stuff may be hard to hear, but hard truths are still better than convenient lies, especially when your life, your health, and your happiness are at stake. But it's not all hard roads ahead. It's just a period of history, just like any other, with good and bad, significant and insignificant. Humans have always found a way to endure challenging times while still managing to pursue their happiness, to express themselves, and to evolve. The biggest transformations of the next 2 decades may take place in the digital realm, but I suspect that what we will value most from the times ahead will be authentic experiences and the communities that we form in mutual support. If you enjoyed this series, please help me get the word out by recommending this show to someone who will appreciate it. Every little bit of help goes a long way, and it's all very much appreciated. And if you still haven't subscribed yet, please do so now. Click that subscribe button wherever you're tuning in. Get notified whenever I publish new episodes of this podcast each Wednesday, or of my monthly lunar mansion guides and other videos. Like I said before, thanks for sticking with me through this series. I'm excited about how it turned out, and I'm also excited to move on to another topic. Next week, we're going to go in a very different direction by examining the problem with solutions, how we often make things worse by trying to make them better, and explore other ways of being in the world. Until then, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.